Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And this is the announcement of a short mini-series of videos. What I'm going to do is a series of videos looking probably one on each book in the Malazan Book of the Fallen, the 10 books, from the position of a reread, knowing the whole series. Because what Philip Chase and I did was we went through each of the books and we always tried to look up to the book that we were on, looking back, never with information from the end, because there is a revelation at the end of the Malazan Book of the Fallen which reframes and adds an additional dimension to the series. Now, I'm going to outline some of the basic points here, but obviously, in order to do this, that requires knowledge of the end of the series. So, before getting to anything to do with spoilers, because I don't want to spoil anyone who's not gotten there yet, when people say that you need to reread the series, just to explain this point, it's not that you need to reread the series in order to understand what is going on. Rereading the series once you know the end adds an additional element. And the way I think we can illustrate this is if we think of the Iliad. When we as modern readers read the Iliad, Achilles appears to be the central focus. We follow Achilles. Even when we look at the film version Troy, Achilles is at the heart of that story because he's the larger than life hero. He's the one that wins in the end. He's the one that we think we should follow. But if we think about it, the Iliad ends with the death of Hector. Hector is the story that we're actually following. The story of the Iliad is all about how Hector dies. That's the story of the Iliad. The Malazan Book of the Fallen is similar in that you're reading through thinking you're reading a story of a certain type. And when you get to the end, there is a revelation. And with this revelation, you realize it was actually a different story, a different frame, a different focus. And once you realize that, you don't have to reread. You can simply think back and go, oh, well, that ties into that and that and that. Oh, I see how this is a through line all the way through. Or you can reread and keep an eye out for those elements and constantly ask yourself, how does this tie into the revelation at the end? That is what people mean by you need to reread. Not that you do not understand what is happening. It's that there's an additional element that people honestly do not want to spoil for you. Because we live in an age where we worry about spoiling someone's experience and spoiling the ending of something. And I think that's a good thing. We're trying to pay attention to how someone else might feel in this regard. Instead of simply insisting, no, I want to talk about this. I'm going to tell you this thing and we're just going to discuss it. It is one of the things that is frequently misunderstood about the series. So you do not need to reread. No one needs to reread this series. And if someone says you must, you need to, they're simply wrong or misstating it. If you reread, there is an additional element that you could not possibly have known when you were reading the text for the first time. So, now to move on to a spoiler section. And this is spoilers for the whole series, because I'm going to mention the thing at the end of the series that people are very careful not to reveal. So, spoilers for the whole of the Malazan Book of the Fallen. Spoilers all the way to the end of the Crippled God, Book 10 of the Malazan Book of the Fallen. This is your spoiler warning. Now that that's out of the way, I am assuming that everyone here has read all the way to the end of the Crippled God. They know what happens at the end of the Crippled God. They are aware of this. And we know that the Crippled God, Kamansod, is freed at the end. But prior to his freeing, he promises to write a book of the fallen to commemorate those that freed him. And then we think of the book ending, or the book ends of the series. The poem at the very beginning of Gardens of the Moon and the poem at the very end of The Crippled God, which are about opening an old book and reading through the Book of the Fallen. And at the end, now that we've reached the end of the Book of the Fallen, we're going to close that book. So the big revelation is that this has been a story about how Kamensod was freed, the events that led up to it, the important information about the key players in that, about the lessons he learned and what he personally thought was really important. Those are all wrapped up into the fact that the crippled god is freed at the end. Instead of being rechained, instead of the different pieces of him being chained and drained of their power and being used by these other people, the Malazans and their allies got these pieces, got enough of these pieces, that the crippled god was able to reconstitute enough of himself to be relatively whole, to be a semblance of who he is, and on the mortal plane. And because of that, when Cotillion kills him, when he kills that mortal form, the crippled god is no longer bound to it. His spirit, his divine essence is freed. And it sort of comes full circle. That we know that the crippled god was called down in a physical form onto this alien world, fragmented. That's what happened to Kalor's realm. We saw that in a flashback. We have encountered both in the Malazan Book of the Fallen and also, more interestingly, a couple of instances in Ian C. Esselmont's novels of the Malazan Empire, aspects of the crippled god. And we know that there have been multiple chainings. When someone finds a piece of the crippled god, this divine flesh imbued with all of this power, that the standard practice has been to imprison it, to use it for more power for us, to utilize and torture the crippled god. And so imagine the crippled god's surprise that Kamensod finds himself surrounded by a bunch of humans who are dying and to protect him. They are dying in their efforts to protect him. They are dying as they are trying to orchestrate his freedom so he will no longer be bound, that he will no longer be a prisoner on this foreign alien world. And that everything in the Malazan Book of the Fallen, there have been some false starts and things that didn't pan out right. But all of the different elements were set up in these 10 books to lead to this moment. And that is the story that we have been following. He is Hector. And so when we look back at the whole of the 10-book series, what we are picking up is Kamensod is the narrator of the Book of the Fallen. He has compiled this book of the lessons and stories that he has learned that recount a fictionalized, narrativized form of how he ended up being freed and who these key players are and how they ended up being part of this plan to free him. And so I'll very briefly go over some of the central points from each of the books. So in Gardens of the Moon, we are introduced to the Malazans and the Tistandi and people from Darujistan. Fast forward to the Crippled God, who are important key players there. We see Malazans. We see these people, the Tistandi. We see how this has all been important. To understand who's freeing him, we have to understand the Malazans. But who is the key central part of who the Malazans are who are freeing him? And it's Tavor. So why not start with Tavor? But to understand who Tavor is, you need to understand how she became Tavor, the adjunct, and then Tavor, the leader of the bonehunters. To understand that, the crippled god feels you need to understand why Perrin isn't there. How Perrin leaving the Empire, betraying the Empire, becoming master of the deck, slipping Lassine's control, why that is an important element. So Gardens of the Moon sets up not only who Perrin is and the knock-on effects that has for the Crippled God story, because remember, Perrin interacts with Kamensod as well, but also for Tavor's story. So starting the story with a focus on Perrin, Gano's Perrin, makes sense. We also have the introduction of Shadowthrone and Cotillion, two humans who had the temerity not only to ascend to godhood, but rejected the game of the gods. They saw the first chaining that they were present at. They witnessed the chaining of part of the Crippled God. And in seeing that, in participating in it, they went, this is wrong. We saw how they rejected pursuing the initial punishment of Lassine because there were bigger things at stake. We see the conflict between what humans value, what gods value, and both Shadowthrone and Cotillion are that point of mitigation between the two spheres. So they are introduced. And we also see the introduction of Anomander Rake into a conflict with the Malazans, into a conflict with the human world. Again, a figure who is part god, part divine, but is fundamentally important to something that comes later in Toll the Hounds. Rake is incredibly important for Toll the Hounds. So this is a good starting point as well for Rake. So we have Rake, Gano's Perrin, Shadowthrone and Cotillion, all localized in the same area. And that is really convenient from a narrative point of view. If I'm going to tell the story about how I ended up somewhere, and I go, there's this thing here that has a whole load of important players all assembled. These people are going to be important later on in the story. Then why not tell this element of their story? So we can see why that is formed that way. And when I do the video on Gardens of the Moon, I will go into this in more depth. I'll tease out elements of theme and how we can look at it with this new light of Kamensod's framing. But that takes us on to Deadhouse Gates. And in Deadhouse Gates, we see these themes of friendship. We see these themes explored of broken people doing the best that they can. Of course, the Crippled God is fascinated by both friendship and love. These are concepts that he, as a tortured being, finds alien. In all of his time on this planet, he has been tortured. And yet, a lot of Deadhouse Gates revolves around the strengths and weaknesses of what love and friendship and these connections can be. We see the failed plans of Tavor in how she tried to save her sister and ultimately ended up leading to the torture of her sister. That is a key aspect. We see that because of the elements of where the whirlwind comes from, how important conflict and these desires of empires and systems of control, they are being introduced here, and we're being shown how destructive they are. And so in this sequence, we get a lot of additional players being introduced who are important to the series, that show and illustrate different aspects that Kamensod wants to talk about that were not in the sequence with Gardens of the Moon, but are equally important, that lead to those events. And of course, one of them we find out is Karsa. He's in this sequence. But at the core of a lot of Deadhouse Gates is the sacrifice that soldiers make to protect others. Stunningly, remember in the Crippled God, that is the thing that he cannot wrap his head around. These humans sacrificing themselves to protect him. And at the center of Deadhouse Gates is the chain of dogs, where Coltane and the Wiccan sacrifice themselves over and over again to protect the refugees. That is a key aspect of Deadhouse Gates, and thematically shows how and where this story of Kamensod is going. And that takes us on to Memories of Ice. We get the memory of the racial enmity between the Talanamas and the Jagat, something that was referred to in Gardens of the Moon. We get explored in more detail here, almost as if the narrator said, oh, I told you about that jagged tyrant in Gardens of the Moon. This is more explanation about it, that prologue, and how it ties in then to Itkovians taking on of their pain for no reason, for no benefit. Itkovian, a mere mortal without divine aid, he has been severed from Fenner. He no longer has that divine connection, but he still sacrifices himself to take on the pain of others, to save others, to help others. Something so fundamental that the crippled god does not understand it at that juncture. And this is the element that is explored. The crippled god has his plan to raise a terrible empire of cannibalistic monsters who are running through and consuming everything as he lashes out. And at the center of that is a Kachin Chamal matron who has been driven mad by pain. And we see the Jagat children who are at the center of binding of that hole, that rift in the warrens. All of that is explored. And we can see how that ties into Kamensaw trying to understand, even though he was doing these things. Ultimately, it ends with him being saved. So he is showing how far he has come and what these people had to do, what they had to forgive. And it illustrates how powerful their sacrifice is, because he wasn't a paragon of virtue. He wasn't a beautiful maiden needing to be rescued. He wasn't any of these things. He was a monster. And yet they still did it. So it illustrates that part of his history. And that takes us on to House of Chains. And we touch back in on one of the central characters, someone who has been mentioned and sort of semi-introduced in Gardens of the Moon, who we see a brief glimpse of in Deadhouse Gates. We turn to Tavor, the person who is so incredibly important to the Crippled God story. And this is an exploration of who Tavor is, how she ends up being able to be the person to free him, and the cost of it, the things that made her the way that she is. The fact that Ganos betrayed the Empire forced her into a position of betraying her sister and trying to orchestrate this plan that all went to ruin, and ultimately, tragically, killing her own sister. And yet, a cruel, amoral, immoral assassin counsels, don't tell her. Don't tell Tavor that she has killed her own sister. That will break her. The one person who you would think would revel in revealing Tavor killed her own sister, just to slide the knife in. He doesn't. He shies away from her. He counsels not to. And that is a small moment, but incredibly important. We also have how revenge as a central theme can be incredibly destructive, but also really alluring. Look at how we react to when Karsa punishes Bideful. We celebrate that. We rejoice in that eye for an eye punishment. But that ultimately leads down the road to what happened to Drishna. That madness, that destruction. And while it is satisfying in the moment, it never repairs the damage that has been done. It doesn't. And so that is a difficult lesson to examine, to absorb, to think about. And so the Crippled God includes it. And that then takes us on to Midnight Tides. But before I move on to Midnight Tides, let's talk a little bit about Karsa. Let's talk about how House of Chains deviates from the structure of the others. It opens with an analysis of, well, who is Karsa? What is his worldview? What is he doing? We see his pride. We see his perception of the world, his very narrow perception of the world based on his parochial worldview, and how it is challenged, how it is broken down, how he learns and how he learns new things, but tries to unlearn the things that he had always just accepted, that this is the way that the world is. And yet everything that happens to him, the trials he undergoes, being captured, being tortured, and seeing this desire to lash out and realizing it's not quite as simple as that. And think of that in parallel to what happened to Kamensod. He was called down, he was broken and tortured and captured and has been lashing out. Hasn't worked out for him yet, has it? It is a lesson he needs to learn. And here it is being illustrated in detail through the character arc of Karsa Orlon. And that brings us on to Midnight Tides. Because if we want to know about the importance of what happens to Kamensod, we saw the introduction of this army, these bone hunters, these people who sacrifice themselves. We see what they're modeling themselves on, the myth of the chain of dogs. We see the capacity that humans have. And now we are tracing out who these people are. We are remembering them. Kamensod is remembering these people and pulling out of their history these moments that illustrate who they are, because he owes them a debt. He wants to follow these people. He wants to give them their moment to be remembered, these people who sacrificed themselves for him. And so in Midnight Tides, oh, sorry, I'd skipped on to the Bone Hunters. But that brings us on to Midnight Tides. And with Midnight Tides, Kamensod said, right, we have set up some of these different elements, particularly to do with the Malazans, but that's not the only thing that I need to discuss. It's not the only thing that I need to set out for you, my readers, to understand. And so with Midnight Tides, it brings in the Tais Dur, it brings in the Letheri, it brings in, at its heart, a relationship between a human and a god. And in that, we see not only the machinations of the Crippled God, not only what Kamensod was trying to do with Rulad, and understanding how monstrous that is, that Kamensod is owning up to his faults. He hasn't learned the lessons yet. That now he's trying to operate within the sphere of this world. He's trying to use cat's paws. He's trying to do things the way that the gods of this world do them. And because of that, it's about systems of control. And we see how the Letheri have manipulated these systems of control to corrupt everything around them, and how the Eater flipped the script on them and essentially do to the Letheri what they did to others, what the Crippled God is trying to do in this world. These other gods treated me badly. They used their followers to treat me badly. I'm going to flip the script. I'm going to do to them what they did to me. And yet ultimately, as we see in Reaper's Gale, that's not going to work out. But in order to understand why it's not going to work out, we have to set up the foundations. This is the Crippled God explaining his position, his new set of plans. He is learning and evolving as the story goes. He's trying to illustrate the mistakes that he made along the way. And that takes us to the Bone Hunters. And there is a point from Midnight Tides I'll bring up with Reaper's Gale, but it takes us to the Bone Hunters, because we've established who Tavor is. We've seen the formation of this army, but they are not who they need to be yet. They are still a Malazan army. And the Bone Hunters, at the center of that, is the formation of this army as an independent throwing off of the chains that have shackled them to a way of behaving. That instead of blaming the Wiccans and taking their point of ascendancy within that system and securing their own power, they sacrifice that stability. They sacrifice that power to do the right thing, to protect the Wiccans, to refuse to play that game. Licine offers power and influence and a role in the system, and Tavor turns it down. Tavor sees through that gambit, sees through that allure, sees through that temptation, and says, no, I'm going to do the right thing. The thing that she should have done in Deadhouse Gates. But instead, she tried to play within the system to save Felasin, and it ended in tragedy. And now here, she's being offered the same thing again. And instead of accepting that, refuses to play the game that the scene has laid out. And that is such a key aspect of what is important to Kaminsod. Because Kaminsod, by this stage, has now been accepted into the deck by the master of the deck, by Tavor's brother. That's how he is trying to operate. And yet Tavor illustrates that you do not have to play by the rules set by others. You can refuse the game. You can turn the tables. You can do something different. And that is a key aspect for Kaminsod in this episode of his story. But coupled to that, we also have what happened at Yigatan. When faced with an enemy, when faced with all of those people who've been trying to kill them and the inferno that ensues, the bone hunters still tried to save their enemy. And like at Kovian, this shocks Kaminsod. This is a key aspect of humanity, the ability to move beyond a simple, they're the bad guy, a simple dichotomy, a simple opposition. The bone hunters, these people who ultimately end up sacrificing their life for him, this is where they are born. This is what he sees as the moment of their birth. And so that is detailed. But let's talk about Reaper's Gale and how, in combination with Midnight Tides, we see this by the Eater conquering the Letheri. They didn't impose a new order. The Letheri ended up corrupting the Eater. So it's a continuation of this aspect, this argument, that by trying to play the game, by trying to impose your will on this system, the system ends up imposing its will on you. And throughout both Midnight Tides and Reaper's Gale, there is a lesson for Kaminsod, and that is you can change. Even as a god, you can change, because at its heart is the relationship between Tehol and Bug, between Tehol and Male. Someone who, Tehol, manipulates the system. He knows how to play with the system. He breaks the system. He shows that he can do it. But it's his relationship with Male that is of particular significance. Think of how much of Midnight Tides and Reaper's Gale is not actually about Tehol's manipulation. It is about Tehol is doing that. That's what he's doing. It illustrates the point. But it's actually about the relationship between him and Bug, not just for comic effect, but the fact that a god who is meant to be above mere mortals, who is meant to live in a different sphere, that Bug is actually changed and humanized through his experience with humans, gains new insight, new life, new vitality through his experience with Tehol. What do we see in the Crippled God? This realization that human beings are not pawns, human beings are not tools, they're not cat's paws. They are beings equal to the gods in at least some respects, if not in terms of their power, but in their ability to change and show us a new way. That through Tehol and Bug, we see these are two beings of completely different origins and power, and yet there is friendship and understanding between them. That mortals are not pawns of the gods. They are beings worthy of respect. And just as the gods can learn this, they can change from this, they can grow from this, so too can humans grow. And there's a relationship between the two. It is not just master-servant, because we see the lie of that in Tehol's relationship with Bug. They pretend it's master-servant, an inversion of what we expect now we know who Bug is. But it's not that. It is friendship. It is the truth of two beings being friends, and the sacrifices that they make for each other, the problems that arise when they try to do things. Think of the pain that Tehol suffers. Think of the anguish that Bug suffers seeing Tehol treated that way. How can this God, this unfeeling God, Male, this destructive God of the sea, how can he be like that? And it's because he has learned. The fact that a God can learn, an elder God, a God so divorced from humanity that we know he was cruel in the past. We know he was destructive in the past. But here we see that he has learned a new way. He has learned from the humans. And that is an important lesson for Kamenson. That takes us on to Toll the Hounds, which Erikson refers to as the cipher. And I've talked before about the structural aspects of that. But let's talk about it in terms of why Kamenson chose to recreate Krupp's narration of these events. Krupp, the embodiment of humanity's capacity to love life. That's why. Krupp is everything that the crippled God is slowly coming to understand. Toll the Hounds is so much about love and grief. Because grief is the flip side of love. If you love something, it ultimately will end in grief. Because nothing on this plane is forever. And so love is vulnerability and opens you up to grief. And Krupp, the vivacious, loquacious Krupp, is the perfect embodiment of that. And what does the story focus on? These events, all these different aspects of love, to show that the crippled God, in all of his time on this planet, who has suffered everything, is now seeing all of these different types of love being illustrated by Krupp. And at the heart of all of this is the sacrifice that a semi-divine being makes for his people. We see the sacrifice of Anamander Rake. That is the keystone at the center of that. But what we also see is that sacrifice, as huge, as mythic as it is, as it shows, again, like Itkovian, the individual sacrificing for others. But we also see the whole story with Stunning and her child. We see the broken story of Chalice. We see all of these different aspects, love in all of its myriad of broken, imperfect forms. And the crippled God exploring this and saying, love is not a single perfect crystalline rose. That's not what love is. Love is so much more complicated than that and shows itself in so many different ways. But it is essential to the human condition. It is essential to being a proper, sentient, sapient being. Love is at the heart of everything. And that brings us on to Dust of Dreams and the Crippled God, where we finally see where all of this has brought us. The events leading up to the formation of the bone hunters that led to the creation of the bone hunters, the destruction of the bridge burners led to the creation of the bone hunters. The whirlwind led to the creation of the bone hunters. Gano's parents' betrayal of the empire led to the creation of Tavor as she is because of his actions. Because of his actions, she felt forced to betray Felison. What happened to Felison shapes her. All of those things are absolutely integral to Tavor's story. They are the foundation blocks that make up her character. And she leads the Bone Hunters, these soldiers that we have seen how they came together, how they were imperfect, but we have seen them go through trials and tribulations together. We have discovered elements of their lives, their personalities, the things that in the Crippled God, Kamenson said that he would remember, he would honor. That has been followed through. And now we see the events that lead up to him being freed. We see the pieces coming together. We understand how Tehol has influenced things to set certain things in motion, to send breeze to help. We see the fallacy of the the Fork of the Seal. We see how their brutal judgment is so much more in line with where the Crippled God started, what he believed at the beginning. But now we see them as the enemy because the Crippled God realizes their way is wrong. It lacks nuance, it lacks empathy, it lacks understanding, it lacks, and I know people turn this into a, a punchline for the Malazan world, it lacks compassion. And that is the central lesson that runs through the Malazan Book of the Fallen. Not compassion as a strange abstract, learning compassion from the point of view of Kamenson, learning that it is not all sunshine and roses, that compassion comes with a cost, love comes with a cost, sacrifice comes with a cost. And Dust of Dreams and the Crippled God set all of that up. Everything that happened with Tul and Tok comes to a head. We see how these interactions are not simple, simplistic, simplified. They're complicated, they are nuanced. And in trying to understand even an individual, we see how they are flawed, they are not perfect, they don't always make the right choices, and mistakes have consequences. That runs all the way through. We see the Kachin Chamal and how they are now trying to learn the very lesson that the Crippled God is learning through this mighty tome of 10 books. Change, adapt, learn empathy and compassion. Because being set in your ways, you fossilize, you ossify, you become trapped, you become irrelevant, like the Fork of the Seal. And so that kind of brings me to the end of this summary, this introduction of just some key points from each of these different books. And it's looking at it from the point of view of Kamenson, looking at it from the point of view of the Crippled God, of him in a form of confessional writing, telling his story about how he ended up being saved and why it was a surprise that these people saved him. It's not his story from beginning to end, just like the Iliad is not Hector's story from when Hector is born all the way to his end. That's one way of telling a story. It's not the only way. And this is what the Crippled God has chosen to focus on. This is what we are given, how he is freed, and the key events, the key players that led up to it, and what he thinks is important about their lives, about their journeys that have shown him now, freed, in a different place, looking back on it. These are the elements that he wants to focus on to show us what he thinks is important. So I will go on and do individual videos about each of the different books. I will go into those things. I'll probably tease out particular scenes, particular lines, but I wanted to have this overview because once you know what the series ends with, you see that this has been a central thread all the way along. And the one perspective we very rarely ever think about is, why is Kamenson telling this story? We are focused on, oh, I love the bridge burners. Oh, that character's cool. I loved it when Karsa did that. And we forget about the framing. This entire epic is being framed by the Crippled God after he is freed, saying, I will honor these people and I will tell you this story. So why is the Crippled God telling these different aspects? Why has he chosen these things? And I think it adds an additional element to our understanding of the Malazan Book of the Fallen. It's one of these additional layers. So thank you very much for watching. Thank you for your continued support, and I will see you in the next one.